Okay, we are, hello, good morning. We are calling to order public meeting number 232 on January 10th, 2018 at the Mass Gaming Commission at 9:30 a.m. First up is approval of minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve the minutes of the December 21st, 2017 public meeting, subject to correction for typographical errors and other non-material matters.
Second.
Any discussion? I had two or three things on page 5, in the middle paragraph, Shara, with the paragraph that starts out Commissioner Zuniga. It just, that first sentence doesn't scan. I think there's a word or two you got to fix. But on the next to the last paragraph that starts Chairman Crosby, I think the main point that I was trying to make was I was basically in favor of reading the list as a narrow list, but that I was agreeing that in the case of some really extreme thing, a really egregious act, like maybe some versions of the kids in the car type thing, that I would be inclined to have it be broad enough to permit that. So you might just take a look at the video and see if you can characterize that a little bit better. And I had one other one. Yeah, I'm not sure where this fits, but on page 7 and 8, the conversation about the junkets. I think one of the main things we talked about that might be in here is whether or not it was appropriate to get all the names and of background information on the customers of the junkets. That was one of the main things we talked about, I think. So, does anybody else have anything?
Yeah, just looking back on the conversation we had about under IEB, I want to make sure, and it might have been under my comments, Sharad, on page 5 that we had, I at least introduced the idea of discussion of thinking of not only kids left in cars, but seniors left in cars. I'm not sure whether that was under the portion where I spoke on page 5 or not, but we can go back and look at that too.
All right, anything else? All in favor with those adjustments?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously. Commissioner Cameron is also not at this meeting. She's out ill. Okay, so next up is the administrative update. Director Bedrosian.
Good morning, Commissioners.
Morning.
Thank you for your flexibility. As you know, this is sort of a makeup meeting due to our snowstorm last week, and it's helpful because we don't want things to get too far behind, and we have an important presentation for you today. So thank you for your flexibility. I have a couple things, but I'm going to suggest I do my general update, and then we go to item number 4 in the discussion about the enhanced ethics. I think we can put after we conclude item number 4, because we are, and I don't anticipate it'll be a problem at all, but we are somewhat time constrained today, given this room is needed for the Public Health Trust Fund meeting in the afternoon. So I would like to introduce a couple new members of our staff first. Our new Chief Information Officer finally joined us started right after the New Year. She's here today, Katrina Jagrup Gomes. Most recently came to us from the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, where she was the Director of IT Operations and Technology. We are very, very happy to have her. I can tell you she's been here for a short week last week and already hit the ground running. So we welcome Katrina to our ranks.
Welcome.
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 And the next person we have to welcome is Crystal Howard, Crystal Howard, a program coordinator who will be working with Director Griffin in workforce and diversity issues. Ms. Howard most recently comes to us as the Alumni Relations Event Coordinator for a small place called Bridgewater State University. So I'm sure she wasn't busy at all.
Actually, the alma mater of Commissioner Cameron.
All right.
That's right.
Excellent. So we're thrilled to have her working with Director Griffin. And matter of fact, I saw her. She was out yesterday at our Access and Opportunity Commission meeting in Springfield. So she too is already hitting the ground running. So we welcome her also.
Welcome aboard.
Which leads me into, I, as I mentioned, was out at the Access and Opportunity Commission meeting yesterday. Maybe I'll leave that portion of the update to Commissioner Stebbins, who was there later on, commissioner updates. But as part of that, I went over to the gaming property with General Counsel Seth Stratton, and got a tour of MGM's corporate offices, MGM Springfield's corporate offices, which they are now in. They just moved in last week, of course, during the storm, into their corporate offices, which are in 95 State Street, which is the building our offices are in. We're on the second floor, and they're on, I think, 8 through 3. And they're very industrial chic. They look like they're still in boxes, but it is another significant milestone that tells us this thing is happening, and it's happening this year. In fact, we have a bunch of staff today who are out taking training for, and I'll call it construction training, training for being on property. For our folks who will help monitor the setup of the gaming floor and other aspects of the property. Once they go through the training, they can, with the appropriate safety gear and knowledge, they can walk around the site unescorted. So that's important. In our offices too, I know Ms. Riley is working hard to get us all outfitted. Our offices look pretty ready. We don't have technology in them yet, but they look pretty ready, and I suspect that we will get a minimal level of occupancy in there within the next 30 days. So
When is Tim going out there? Tim Babbitt?
That's a good question. I don't know the exact date soon. I think he'll start to Tim Babin, who is now lieutenant from the state police, so he'll be our commander for the gaming enforcement unit out there. I will check on that, but I think it's relative because we're getting gaming agents out there as the floor starts to get set up. We're getting those folks out there and working with their folks, and I met a lot of new folks from MGM Springfield I hadn't seen before, so they're really starting to fill in. They're really starting to fill in the ranks below the executive team. So as I said, it's starting to be real.
Great.
So,
Is Burke out there on a regular basis now?
I think Burke is out there routinely. I think Bruce stops by, depends upon Burke. But we're starting to restructure the gaming agents, so we'll have a person, the new Burke. There'll be a Burke out in Springfield, and that will be
I
actually.
thought Burke was going to be out in Springfield.
No, Burke will be overseeing the whole thing. Actually, Angela Smith will be out in Springfield.
Oh, okay.
So,
and who's going to take over in PPC?
Jay Lindros will take over PPC. So we're starting to move up people and feed underneath them. And as you know, we're going to have to hire a group of new agents sometime in the spring and have a training class. And in fact, what the public can't see is at the end of this room, we've already, we have some tables that are covered because we're a little space constrained, and when we're not doing public meetings in this room, we're going to break it up and use it for training space. So we're trying to, make as much smart use of the space as we can. So, but there will be no gaming during public meetings.
There's no actual gaming that takes place.
There is no
It's
action.
only
There is
training
actually,
gaming.
it's all training purposes.
There's no
You
wagering.
got that,
Exactly. No.
You got that State House News Service.
So.
What about you doing your, what is it called, jury or something or other presentation? You were going to bring your critical path chart.
Yeah, I think that's the next meeting.
18th?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's the
Okay.
next meeting, the 18th, right?
So that'll be in your makeup, in your presentation on the 18th.
Yeah, and the presentation on the 18th. Yeah,
Good.
yeah. So that's so my suggestion is that we advance to item 4, Director Vanderlinder, and then we can circle back to the outstanding items because I think that's the important item to get done today.
Okay. So So, let me just make sure I know what I'm doing here. Okay, so we'll skip over the enhanced code of ethics and come back to that after.
Correct.
Director Vanderland.
Great. Good morning.
Good morning.
Chairman,
Morning.
Commissioners. I am joined by Dr. Rachel Volberg, who will be doing a bulk of the presentation this morning. I actually was trying to figure out how best to tee this important topic up. And what I thought I would do is refer back to a memo that I presented to the Gaming Commission in November of 2014. It was on that date that the commission decided to go ahead and voted to launch the Massachusetts Gaming Impact Cohort Study. Interestingly, it was actually approved by the MGC in April of 2014, but we made the decision to wait until later in 2014 after the referendum didn't pass in order to launch this study. So the memo goes on to state that the proposed longitudinal cohort study of gambling behavior satisfies an objective in section 71 of chapter 23K, which specifically calls for this study to understand the etiology of gambling and problem gambling. The study will follow a group of people with a shared experience, exposure to expanded gaming, at intervals over time. This type of study can provide detailed etiological information about how gambling and problem gambling develops, progresses, and remits. The information collected will have significant value as it will highlight risk and protective factors important in developing effective prevention, treatment, and recovery support services. So a couple notes on that. One is obviously we have limited expanded gaming in the Commonwealth right now, and the cohort to date really establishes a solid baseline through two waves of the cohort.
Was there no overlap, or was this
There
the
was
case for
very brief overlap, which I
Rachel
believe
will talk
that
about. Okay.
Rachel will talk with you about. The second important piece is you will see that as Rachel is talking to you about this, it is largely using the same information. It is largely meeting the objectives that the original this proposal that I presented to you in November of 2014 set out to do. This is a longitudinal study, so Rachel will present to you the difference between wave 1 and wave 2. But our goal is that this is a cohort study that will extend well into the future, and after we are fully implemented in terms of the number of casinos that will be operating. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Volberg to talk to you about magic.
Great.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
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 I say it's a pleasure to be in Boston again, but because you started the meeting early today, I actually drove in last night, so I had a bit of fun walking around Faneuil Hall and the area downtown. And
Where'd you stay?
over at the Bostonian.
Great.
But
great
I did bring my snow boots, and I was very glad I did
Yeah.
because you guys have as much snow as we do out in Western Mass.
Oh.
At any rate, it is very exciting, realizing that it's been 3 years since the start of this study. It's very exciting to finally be able to present some results to you. I just wanted to preface the presentation by saying that, to my knowledge, this is the only jurisdiction, Massachusetts is the only government anywhere in the world that has made the decision to move ahead with this particular type of study before an expansion of gambling has actually occurred. And from an intellectual or an academic's perspective, that makes it, again, a tremendously groundbreaking opportunity for someone like myself who has been engaged with doing this kind of study always in other jurisdictions and always after gambling has expanded in multiple ways in those jurisdictions. So it's a way to understand what's happening with problem gambling before you actually have that full expansion. And so
It's a whole basic the baseline piece of our whole research agenda, right?
Right.
Is that We
Right.
have for the first time, we have a baseline for everything, whether it's the etiology or incidence or all the other things too.
And prevalence and,
Right.
and all of the social and economic
Right.
indicators that we're
Right.
looking at through SIGMA as well.
Right, it's great.
So I just wanted to make that point because, again, just thinking back to the very first time I came before the commission and was like, I can't believe I'm setting off on this wonderful project that you're letting me do. It's truly been something that has been such an opportunity, and I thank you for that.
Rachel, kind of on that point, that is my understanding accurate that this data was collected in September of 2015?
The data was collected between March of 2015 and September of 2015. That's right.
Okay, because I found myself actually crossing out 15 because I thought it was a typo.
You thought it was 16?
I thought it was 6. I thought it was 16, but it is 15. So this really is before. It's only a couple of months worth of PPC having been in operation. Right?
Yeah, about 5% of the interviews that we completed for Magic were completed after the opening of Plainridge Park. So 167 people, and none of them had gambled at Plainridge.
And Commissioner, that is wave 2. So that's the latest wave. Wave 1 was actually comprised of the original Sigma
Right.
general population.
No, I got that.
Okay, so moving into the slides. Given that it's been a couple of years since I presented about the methodology that we were proposing to use, I thought it would be helpful to everybody to go back and revisit some of the key terms that we use in talking about cohort studies. I wanted to do a little bit of background on what other jurisdictions where these kinds of studies have been done, just to give you an overview of the characteristics of those studies. I wanted to then turn and talk about the specific goals that we have for Magic and our current status, and then hopefully fairly quickly get into the key findings and give you all a chance to ask some questions about what we think are the implications, and then finish up with some future directions. So just to remind you, this is a slide that we presented to you some time ago, talking about the differences in the design of the two pieces of work that we're doing. So SIGMA, the Social and Economic Impacts of Gambling in Massachusetts, is what's called a repeat cross-sectional study. And what that means is that in terms of secondary data, we are, keeping up to date with all of those data as they're published. In terms of primary data, particularly in terms of the survey data, the repeat cross-sectional means that we did a survey in 2013, 2014, and we're planning another large population survey after all of the casinos have become operational for a year, but those are not the same people in each of those samples. The cohort study is a different beast. It's basically following the same people and taking those snapshots, but with the same group of people who are exposed to an event at a particular point in time. It gives you a much sort of more fine-grained picture of what's happening with people's behavior over time. And we think of it in research terms more as a moving picture, because it's the same people. You have your characters moving through your movie, if you will. When we presented to you the first time, we put together a different bathtub picture for you. And as I was thinking about this presentation, I realized maybe we needed several different bathtubs, because when I went on Google and looked at images, none of them gave me like all of the pieces of the puzzle. So epidemiological folks think about prevalence as sort of the level of the water in a bathtub. And there's ways to make the level move up, and there's ways to make the level move down. So if you want to make the level move up, you increase the incidence. I mean, actually, you don't want to make the level move up. You want to always be trying to get it down from a disease management perspective. But incidence is adding new cases to the population that's in the bathtub. So that's new cases adding to your prevalence. The way you sort of lower the level of the water is unfortunately through mortality. And we know that problem gamblers have fairly high rates of suicidal ideation attempts. So that is a factor in problem gambling prevalence, but also through remission. If you look at the less colorful bathtub, you can see that the level of the water can change if you get a lot of people recovering from the disorder. And then back over to the more colorful bathtub, you can increase the level of the water if you have a lot of people who had a problem in the past and then experience a problem again, and that's recurrence or relapse. And we know that that's a factor not just with other addictive disorders, but also particularly with gambling. When there's a new form of gambling that's introduced, the people who are vulnerable in the population because they've had a problem in the past are then more liable to relapse.
But isn't that also doesn't that also imply some recovery?
Yes.
Somebody may have at least temporarily recovered. Whether that was real recovery or not, we can have a separate discussion. But
well, it certainly would be recovery in the sense that they're not experiencing a problem at the time that we ask them about it at a particular point in time. But someone who's had either a substance use problem or a gambling problem, behavioral addiction, even if they recover, and many of them do on their own, they're still more vulnerable to developing a problem again in the future. And if you add to the risk factors by, suddenly there's a great big new casino down the street, and they happen to be a casino gambler who has stopped gambling or has cut back on their gambling because of concerns that they had, that is then, sort of a risk factor for them that you want to be aware of. So it's very helpful to know, what the proportion of your prevalence rate is of people who have a gambling problem. It's important to know how many of them are sort of chronic and how many of them are sort of moving in and out because they require different kinds of services. So here's another fun picture, etiology, which is the long-term goal for the cohort study, is to understand the risk and protective factors that are associated with developing a gambling problem, and then with helping people to get into remission and into recovery, and to establish, in particular, long-term recovery is something that's important to know protective factors for. So following people over time, because you're following the same people, you can see sort of changes in their status, and you can begin to tease out what it is in time one that predicts change of status in time two. And that's the power of this kind of study design, is that you can predict the changes. You can look at the predictors and start to sort out what the most powerful predictors are and how you can increase those changes in status over time. So turning to talk about the background a little bit, there were quite a number of early small-scale cohort studies. When I say early, probably starting in the early 1990s, certainly not before that, and all the way through to the mid-2000s. All of them had fairly serious limitations. They were limited to maybe young people or to casino workers, or they asked about gambling, but they didn't ask about problem gambling. Most of them only went for 2 or 3 waves, so you couldn't really say anything long-term about the people in the study. And those limitations actually led, starting in the mid-2000s, to the launch of 5 very large-scale cohort studies in 4 different countries. Rob Williams, who's our co-principal investigator on both Sigma and Magic, was either the PI or a co-PI on the 2 studies in Canada, the LLLP and the QLS. And I actually have been fortunate enough to be on the research teams for the Swedish, Australian, and New Zealand studies. So these are all pieces that I've had involvement with.
I'm right, Rachel, that that these 5 all were subject to the same limitations you had originally said. There's no baseline, right? These picked
That's
up in,
correct,
in
yes.
the middle of an operation of new casino.
Yeah, so all of these jurisdictions had casinos, and in the case of Australia and New Zealand, widespread gaming machines for quite a number of years, at least 10 to 15 years before these studies were launched. So I'm not going to walk through all of the details of this. We certainly, in the report, we talk about what each of these sort of rows deals with. I think the 2 things I want to highlight here are that the interval in each case was about 12 months. The assessment length was quite variable, but the interval, except for the LLLP, was about 1 year between each of the assessments that people went through. The studies involve either somewhere between 4 and 6 assessments in each of these cases. And the problem gambling measure that was used, only the QLS used the PPGM, which is the measure that we use in both Sigma and Magic. The others used the CPGI, the Canadian Problem Gambling Index, which we also use in our 2 studies. But the PPGM has some different performance characteristics, so we have sort of opted with that. But we do have comparability across all of these studies.
Rachel, how many are continue? How many of these will continue besides
All
in
of
addition to the
them,
5?
all of them are completed actually, except for the New Zealand study. I believe New Zealand is planning at least 1 more wave. I should mention that the Swedish study is concluded, but only because the cohort had become small enough by 2015 that the Swedish government decided, or 2014, the Swedish government decided to fund a new prevalence survey that is now going to be followed by a new cohort study. So they've upped the ante on us a little bit in terms of deciding to just redo the whole design with a very large baseline prevalence survey and then following the cohort over time. And I should mention they're continuing, there are discussions, I should say, about continuing to follow their previous cohort, even though the numbers are smaller, continuing to sort of, because you can get, the longer you can keep someone in a study like this, the richer your data become. So the question comes down to, why did we do Magic? I have to say, back in 2013, I had to pull my jaw off the ground when I was told that the Gaming Commission was thinking about doing a cohort study, because that wasn't supposed to happen in my lifetime, but I'm certainly glad that I'm here to be able to participate. So as I mentioned, there have been no major cohort studies of gambling and problem gambling in the US, certainly not with adults. There might be, no, not adolescents either. The other point to emphasize is that the change in gambling availability in Massachusetts during this cohort study is going to be more substantial than other cohort studies conducted internationally. We mentioned just a few minutes ago about the other jurisdictions. I think what's exciting is that Rob Williams and I have been able to really sort of build on our experience in these other cohort studies that we've been involved with. We've seen some of the mistakes that we've made and that our colleagues have made, but we've also sort of figured out like what works. And so it's been really fun to sort of be able to build on that and, build a better bridge, given what we learned about the ones that had gone before. And the other really exciting piece is that we had predicted that MAGIC would be very synergistic with Sigma, producing results that would inform, that each study would produce results that would inform the other. And I have to say that we have already found that to be the case. In our report, we actually discuss some of the implications of the findings from MAGIC, but in terms of service development. But then we also point to the deeper analyses that we did from the BGPS data and fold those into the MAGIC report to sort of talk about, well, we can't say as much about this as we would like with MAGIC data, but here's this data from Sigma that informs what we have learned from MAGIC. So that, again, is an exciting development. This is a rather ugly slide. I apologize for all of the verbiage. But basically, this outlines the three major goals that we have for MAGIC. The first is to examine incidence. Again, that's the proportion of new cases that are developing in Massachusetts over a period of time. The second major goal is to examine stability and transitions associated with problem gambling, to look at how people move into and out of problem gambling. And then finally, once we have a number of waves of data, to develop a full etiological model of problem gambling, which will help us in guiding development of problem gambling services in Massachusetts and hopefully elsewhere in the US and internationally. Again, a lot of sort of tiny writing here, but just to remind you that wave one of the study actually was our very large baseline general population survey. What we did was we drew a stratified sample from the BGPS. It was about half of our respondents, but I'll explain this in a minute. We picked them, or we selected them based on behavior that they told us about in the baseline survey. We launched wave two, which is actually the establishment of the cohort, in March of 2015. We finished it in September of 2015, not 2016. And the cohort size is 3139. As we were sort of working on analyzing the wave two data, we also were going out and getting ready and then fielding wave three of the cohort study. Wave three was a quite expanded questionnaire that we used to capture etiological factors more comprehensively. We have DSM screens for numerous psychiatric disorders that we know are associated with problem and pathological gambling, but we also put in a number of measures that looked at people's personality characteristics. So there was quite a lot of additional information. The size of the cohort went down a little bit. Only 2,455 people participated in wave three, but we still considered the 3139 to be the cohort. And in wave four, which we're preparing to launch in a couple of months, we actually are going to go back to all of our people in the cohort and try to get information from them. So even if someone's missing data in one wave, we still believe it's very valuable to try and keep them going and get information from as many people as possible.
I'm sorry, we may be asking the same question, but when are you planning on reporting wave 3 and 4 together, or when can we expect wave 3? Because you're reporting on wave 2 essentially, right?
I'm reporting on wave 2. We're a little bit delayed on wave 2 because of some of the review process that we ended up going through. Wave 3, we actually have a small report planned for on wave 3 in June of this year. It's one of our fiscal year 18 deliverables. I don't imagine that it will be a full full report of all of the results, because the results are quite complex and there's a lot of them. But we'll probably, we'll certainly update on the methodology, and we'll update on some key findings. And then wave 4, you'll recall that we have a 2-year gap between wave 3 and wave 4 for some budgetary reasons. We haven't really talked about what the reporting process is going to be, but I have discussed with Rob the fact that by the time we have wave 4 data in hand, it might be time to start thinking about, are we going to be able to do some etiological analysis and start to look at filling in, that risk and protective factors piece, which I know is of real importance in the service development.
But even wave 4 would be before the introduction of the
major
Wynn
casinos
and the main casinos.
Yeah, and the exciting piece about this is that we now are going to have 3 measures of what we call natural incidents, which is basically incidents that we're looking at before the introduction of the big casinos, and that's something that we really don't know whether a big introduction or a vast expansion changes incidence. But this is going to be a very important study in terms of being able to answer whether there's a change in incidence from pre to post.
But there's going to be the slots parlor that would have been open during those last 2 waves. But you're suggesting,
and that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at, is how people's behavior changed with the introduction of the slots parlor, and if there's a change in incidence, are we going to be able to tie it to some particular type of behavior, or is it going to be something that's much more general? Is it going to be other kinds of vulnerabilities, say with substance use, or psychiatric disorders, or who knows?
Rachel, in wave 4, as Commissioner McDonald just pointed out, you're going back out into the field prior to MGM and Wynn opening. Is there some value in the research of not only looking at people's behavior, but also assessing what is your attitude? What is your, is there a excitement or expectation over opening these 2 facilities that you would go back and then in wave 5, I guess, look at how those attitudes about gaming might have changed?
We actually have a number of questions in each of the waves about people's attitudes towards gambling, right. Not just gambling in general, but gambling in Massachusetts in particular, and gambling in their communities. So it's the same questions that we had in the BGPS and in the targeted surveys. We can certainly talk with NORC about adding some additional attitudinal questions, but we do have a suite of questions.
How long can the cohort be useful as it degrades size-wise?
Well, that is an excellent question to which I do not have a good answer. The decision in Sweden was based on 2 factors. One was the size of the cohort was getting quite small relative to the original baseline survey. So I think we were down to, well, in Sweden, they like very large samples. So our initial cohort was actually 8,100 people. And I think we were down to about 3,000 when we agreed that it was getting too small. But the other issue was the age of the cohort. So, people age year by year. And so in the case of the baseline survey, we interviewed people who were 18 and over. By the time we got out to wave 2, establishing our cohort, there wasn't going to be anyone that was 18 to 19. It was all going to be 19 and over. And so as your cohort ages, you begin to have that gap in your cohort of you're not able to represent anybody who's younger than the age of your cohort. And I'm trying to think. We started in Sweden. We started in 2008, and by 2014, we all agreed that we needed to sort of take a look at younger people again. But we were looking at people who were 16. So in Sweden, they limit surveys to people who are 16 to 84. I don't know why 84 is the cutoff, but it is. So, you know, we were missing people who were sort of 16 to 22. And the investigators the lead investigators in Sweden decided that they needed to go back out to a population survey to fill up that pot again.
So can you replenish the cohort without losing the integrity of the data? I don't know how that works.
Well, that's a series of discussions that we have had internally, and we are hoping to be able to share that with you and other folks who come out to our annual meeting in May. And then going forward, we obviously, the best opportunity we think to replenish the cohort is probably with the follow-up general population survey that we're planning for 2020.
Right.
But there may be some other things that we can do. We're getting some expert advice from NORC. We want to get some feedback from the research review committee, and from yourselves as well.
Okay.
But isn't this a problem that just inheres in any cohort study?
Yes, it
By
is.
definition.
By definition, it applies to every cohort study. Yes. So the issue is, I think, how important do we feel it is to have younger people in the cohort? I remember when we were getting ready to go out for the baseline survey, somebody, I forget who, said, why are you bothering with people who are 18? Because the age to gamble at a casino is 21 in Massachusetts. And I had to point out that, in fact, you can buy a lottery ticket and you can go to the horse races and you can play bingo when you're 18 in Massachusetts. So, you know, people have access to some forms of gambling. It may not be to casino gambling, but, you know, you still want to have those younger people.
You could actually also go to Rhode Island, where it's legal to be 18.
Right.
What about people who move? And maybe you already answered your question, this question earlier, but
yeah, mobility is another challenge to conducting cohort studies. Interestingly enough, Massachusetts has quite a low mobility rate compared to other states, even states close by. But we have worked with NORC in doing locating for our cohort members. So they have tools at hand to try and track people down. Just because they leave Massachusetts for a little while doesn't mean they're not going to come back.
I don't know that, but after the last 2 weeks, I think that you might find a considerable bump up.
Yeah, all those snowbirds leaving.
well, I'm specifically thinking of students too, who come here and go back and are part of the young population.
Yeah. No, we think about those things on a regular basis.
Good.
Okay, I'm not going to go into weighting a great deal. This was the source of quite a lot of discussion and work. But basically, we did weight the cohort to adjust for a number of different things. Most specifically, the stratified sample design, which I'll explain in a minute, but also for some of the differential response rates that we got by group. Initially, we weighted by gender, age, race, ethnicity, and education. In the second round of weighting, after consultation with the research review committee, we adjusted the weights to account for likely participation bias. And I'll explain that in a minute again. But basically, the reason we did the weighting was to allow us to more confidently generalize the incidence rate to the population of Massachusetts as a whole.
Could you just pause for a moment and help me with the concept of weighting? Because this is the part of the study of your report that I found most difficult to understand.
Well, I will
I suggest
confess.
you just accept it as a fact rather than.
I just don't know completely understand the concept. I'm not asking you
So,
to go
okay,
into the
so when
details.
you, I'm going to try and do this in plain English, but
Right.
please understand that I am not a biostatistician. I actually have an emeritus professor on my team who does all this stuff for us and comes in and explains it to us, and we all go, well, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure? And we pick it apart. And then when we're
Well, then I don't
satisfied,
feel
we
so
turn it over to
self-conscious
the
that
research
right,
review
some of those
committee,
issues.
and they pick it apart, and then it comes back to us, and we try and put it back together again.
Okay.
So I'm going to do my best here. When you have a population and you take a sample, weighting is what you use to adjust your sample so that you can say something about the whole population. Because each person that you pull from the population represents a much larger group of people. So I'm a 63-year-old white woman with a PhD. I represent quite a lot of white middle-aged women with a PhD living in Western Massachusetts. But if I were living in Eastern Massachusetts, I would be a much smaller part of the pool of middle-aged white women with a PhD than I am in Western Massachusetts. So because I'm in Western Massachusetts, the statistical weight that is assigned to me is different than if I were in Eastern Massachusetts, okay? So what the weighting process does is it takes the characteristics of every individual in the sample and it adjusts them up or down based on a number of pre-selected characteristics. And with the idea that ultimately you're trying to talk about the 5.1 or 5.2 million adults in Massachusetts as a whole. Okay? Does that help?
Yeah, that helps a lot.
Okay.
It's their best guess, and they go through to get the representation of the actual population.
And you will hear Ed Stanek say on a regular basis, weighting is more art than science. There is certainly some science and a lot of statistics involved, and he geeks out on the science all the time. But at the end of the day, there are assumptions built into any weighting scheme, and you can question those assumptions, and you have to go back and really, have a good rationale for why you picked the variables that you picked to adjust the sample to the population.
Great. Thank you.
Does that help? Oh, good. Okay. My first biostatistics lecture, and I passed. Okay, this is a table rather than verbiage. Basically, what you have on the left-hand side are the strata. These are the characteristics of the people in the baseline general population survey that we felt were important to look at. So obviously in the sample that we drew from the BGPS, that first column, the drawn sample, that 4860, we had 133 problem gamblers. That was 100% of all of the problem gamblers that we had in the BGPS. We had 450 at-risk gamblers. We had much larger numbers of people who spent $100 a month or more on gambling, or $1,200 a year. We had a large group of people who gambled weekly. We had a very small group, but a very interesting group of folks who had served in the military after 9/11. And you'll remember in the BGPS that they had a very, very high prevalence rate of problem gambling. And so we wanted to make sure that we included them in the cohort study in case there was something specific about military service that we could tease out. And then we had a random selection of everyone else in the BGPS. I will say that the first 5 strata, from the problem gamblers to the military service, those strata were 100%. We picked everybody that met that criterion and put them in our drawn sample. And then we took a third of the other BGPS respondents randomly. The achieved sample is the sample that we now have as the established cohort, the 3139. And then the last column in the table shows you the response rate by group. So we didn't, you never get 100% of your sample when you go to do a survey. You get a response rate, or some people choose to opt in, some people choose to not opt in. Overall, for the drawn sample, we achieved a response rate of 65%, but you'll see that it's a little bit different by the risk strata. So actually, problem gamblers were less likely to participate in the survey than some of the folks in the other strata.
Rachel, I was just glancing over the averages here.
Mhm.
Maybe this is just due to the number of people, but I'm not just the problem gamblers, but the military service
Mhm.
has a higher than the average. Do you think it might be attributable just to the number, to the low number in those two groups, problem gamblers and military service?
Well, so that's not there's no overlap. So anybody who was in military service and had a gambling problem was going to be in the problem gambler group. And then these were other people who were in the military who had had service since 9/11, who didn't have a gambling problem, but were still in our drawn sample.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking of them collectively.
Oh, okay.
I'm just looking at them, and they seem to be the two odd numbers on the averages altogether. As in
Yeah.
everybody sort of coalesced otherwise around a 65%
Yeah, I mean,
response
it
rate,
could be.
except these two groups.
So on the very small group, on the military service, it could be that it's just an anomaly that,
Because it's very small people.
because it's a very
Number
small
of
group, they just might have a higher response rate, for unknown reasons. It might be that they're more dedicated to public service, and so that they're more likely to do a survey, or to, agree to participate in a long-term study. It's hard to say.
Right.
Problem gamblers, we know that they tend to have lower response rates to gambling studies. We think it probably has to do with some sort of self-perception of their own gambling problem that makes them reluctant to talk about their gambling.
Rachel, is another way of synthesizing this to just say we lost 35% of the sample from the last wave?
No, because this is establishing the cohort. We didn't lose anybody. We're going to follow all of these 31, 39 over time.
So you don't consider the original 48 the cohort?
No, that was just the basis for the sample. That was just the basis for establishing the cohort.
They have to agree to participate first.
Yeah,
But
so
you used the 4860 as your baseline data, right? That's how you got it a change. That's how you calculated incidence.
no, we're not calculating
Oh, you're only
incidence on
talking
the
about
4860.
on the 3-1. Okay.
Yeah.
So you could almost call this wave 1 rather than wave 2. But okay, I get it. Okay.
Yeah, there was a lot. We discussed again. This was like, you guys are hitting on all the things that we sort of spent days and days talking about, and
Right.
came to a decision. And now I'm thinking like, yeah, why did we decide to call it wave 2 instead of wave 1? I know we had a really good reason.
Right. Okay.
One last point I wanted to make from this slide is this is a way in which it really is synergistic with the larger Sigma study, that a low base rate disorder like problem gambling is really difficult to track in a cohort. But because we were able to identify these specific groups within the original Sigma general population baseline study, it amplifies our ability to really gather information about gambling behavior from the group that we're most interested in, or groups we're most interested in.
Okay. So this is just a really nice map to show you the location of all of the addresses of the people that agreed to be in the cohort. We were really glad to see that it looked a lot like the population of Massachusetts, the distribution of the population of Massachusetts. And now, finally, for some key findings. Wait. Oh, yeah. Okay. So one of the first things we looked at was between 2013, 2014, and 2015, or so. I'm going to shorten that and say between 2014 and 2015. we looked at changes in individual members of the cohort's gambling participation between those two waves. And what this shows you is that there was a small, it was statistically significant increase in overall gambling. The two main types of gambling that contributed to that increase were actually casino gambling and horse racing. There was also an increase in the mean number of types of gambling that people had done. But I just want to emphasize that while these were statistically significant, all of these changes were quite small. And so the main reason that we felt that this was of interest is because in all of the other jurisdictions, gambling participation has generally reduced between waves. People tend to do less and less gambling over time. And so that was our first kind of little surprise about this study in particular. Was it seemed to go in the opposite direction of the other studies that we have done.
But those are the same studies where they started after the introduction, sometimes after the introduction of casinos, right?
and we definitely thought that there might be, we felt that there might be some logical reasons why this would be the case, but because it's the first time that we've done a cohort, where we've established a cohort in a jurisdiction that didn't yet have like all of the gambling that we knew was coming, we just were surprised to see it going in the opposite direction. Usually,
Yeah.
When you've got 5 studies that are going one way and you get one that goes the other way, you're like, all right, let's stop and think what could be going on here.
Right.
Rachel, do respondents, talking about sports betting, are they, obviously it's,
It does look like it edged up a bit. It was not statistically significant.
okay, but do they understand that, I mean, do they identify a difference between sports betting and doing DFS, that type of activity as well?
I don't think that because we were in the field, or we were already I think we had already finalized the questionnaire when DFS, all of that stuff blew up in I think it was 2015, September of 2015.
Mm-hmm.
We would have already been out of the field. So there was something else going on than DFS right there.
Okay.
But what we did do was in wave 3, we added some additional questions about to get greater detail about sports betting, because we knew that DFS had blown up. So we'll definitely be taking a look.
Just
at
trying to think of what the respondent's attitude is what I'm engaging in sports betting, or
Yeah.
is something else I'm doing,
something
i.e.
else I'm doing.
the
Yeah.
Final Four and all the other
Right.
activities.
That's not betting.
That's not bad.
That's something else with my friends.
Why do you say that the increase is due to lottery and horse racing when A, they all went up, and B, it looks to me like the largest increase after horse racing was probably casino.
She said casino.
I said casino and horse racing.
Oh, I thought you said lottery and horse. Okay,
No, sir.
okay,
Got
got it.
And it's all based on statistics. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Right. No, that makes sense. I misunderstood. Sorry.
Okay, let's move on. Okay, from my perspective, this is actually the much more interesting stuff. I mean, gambling participation is good to know when you're talking about problem gambling, but this is really where the meat of our work has been over the last year or so. Basically, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the care that we took to actually match people to make sure that they were the same person who participated in wave 1 and wave 2, but we did a lot of work to do that. And then we looked at problem gambling status in wave 1 and problem gambling status in wave 2. And I'll just draw your attention to the bottom of the table. You'll see that there's a small number of respondents in our overall cohort who were either missing problem gambling status in wave 1 or were not a problem gambler in wave 1 and had known problem gambling status in wave 2, or we couldn't figure out in wave 2 what their problem gambling status was because they hadn't answered enough of the questions in the problem gambling section of the questionnaire. So we put all of them below the bar as far as being able to use their information to determine incidence and remission. So the key groups are the people in wave one who were not a problem gambler in wave one and not a problem gambler in wave two. You can see it's a very large group. Then the incidence cases are actually the people who were not a problem gambler in wave one, but were a problem gambler in wave two. Those are your incident cases. Those are the new problem gamblers in wave two. Then you've got another, the next row is they were a problem gambler in wave one and not a problem gambler in wave two. Those are your remitted cases. So those are people who are in remission. But we know they had a problem in wave one, so we know they are vulnerable to having a problem in the future. And then you've got your ongoing cases, which are problem gambler in both waves of the study.
So ideally, perhaps these other studies, the delta between 60 and 40 would be a negative, right? If people are adapting to the introduction in the long term.
The delta.
So the delta between 60 and 40 is
20.
the increase in incidence. Is that?
Am
I oversimplifying it?
It's not a net number.
Yeah, I mean it's you have to look. So basically, your incidence cases, your incidence is, and I'm going to do this next. I'll wait to show this next slide. The incidence is only calculated on the people who were not problem gamblers in wave one. So your incidence is 60 divided by 2943 plus 60.
Mm-hmm.
Your remission is actually 40 divided by 40 plus 39. So you actually, it's more like 50% remission.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Because you've got different denominators because you're looking at different things.
Yep.
Okay?
Yes.
All right. That was the hardest part, actually, thinking about how I was going to explain that. So I have this red circle. When you look at the whole sample, you've got 2.3% of people in the full cohort who went from weighted cohort who went from being not a problem gambler to being a problem gambler. And then you've got the 1.1% of problem gamblers who remitted. There's a long discussion in the report about this if you care to get into it, but the weighted prevalence is 2.4%. And the unweighted prevalence, as the review committee pointed out, is somewhat lower at 2.0%. The reason is because of the characteristics of the people who did develop a gambling problem were more likely to have high weights. They were young, they were minority, and they had low education. And then last but not least, this is what we call a transition table. And this is basically to start to talk about the second major goal that we have for MAGIC, which is to examine transitions within the cohort. I just want to emphasize that this is unweighted data, so we're not trying to talk about the population at this point. We're trying to talk about the individuals in the cohort. The most stable group was recreational gamblers in wave one. 80% of them remained recreational gamblers in wave two, followed by non-gamblers about...
Where are you getting that number?
I'm sorry. If you... Do I have a pointer on here? I do, but it doesn't show. So if you look at the table, I'll put on my glasses so I can see it as well. If you look at the column that at the top, it says complete data wave two.
Yeah.
And then you look down on recreational gamblers.
Yeah.
you'll see a dark blue rectangle that has 1723 and 80.3% in it.
Right.
That means 83%, 80.3% of the recreational gamblers in wave one, which is on the left-hand side, remained recreational gamblers in wave two.
Oh, I think I'm just getting this chart because I had a question about this chart when I
Okay.
first read it.
So let's start with non-gamblers. If you look up at that square that says 298 and 64.4, what that says is that there were 298 non-gamblers in wave one who were still non-gamblers in wave two, and they represent 64.4% of all of the non-gamblers in wave one.
So, can I
Mhm.
can I do that? The following is the 177 recreational gambler on wave one.
Who are non-gamblers in wave two.
Exactly.
Yes,
How is that related to the 158
the 158.
recreational gambler?
So that is non-gamblers in wave one who became recreational gamblers in wave two.
Okay. So the axis, the column goes
The
first.
columns are wave two and the rows
The
are
rows are
wave one.
wave one.
So, but the highlighted squares are what I was trying to talk to you about, is the proportion of each of the groups in wave one who remained in that group in wave two.
Yeah.
And you can see that recreational gamblers were the most stable, and actually at-risk gamblers were the least stable.
Is there any number here between the waves that is besides the one that goes exactly at 45 degrees, I guess? That's important for us to understand.
Yes. So there's a couple of numbers that are important to understand. If you look along the row of non-gamblers, you can see that while 64% of them remained non-gamblers, actually a third of them transitioned into recreational gambling, and a very small percentage, but a very important percentage, went all the way over from being non-gamblers
To at risk.
to being at-risk gamblers.
That's a 7 and
The
one and a half.
the N equals 7, it's 1.5% of that group. Similarly, you have movement for the recreational gamblers in wave one. You have about 10% who transitioned into being at-risk gamblers, and you have another 1% who actually transitioned all the way to being problem and pathological gamblers.
Where are those last two?
The 22
Yeah.
on the recreational gambler, but they're in problem and pathological gambling on wave two.
But then the other italicized number are these at-risk gamblers that became non-gamblers, right? The 8
Yes,
and the 2.
and the reason they're italicized is because the group is so small that the estimate is unstable. The statistical estimate is unstable. It's variance.
Not statistically significant, or is that a new term?
No, we're not talking about statistical significance when we're talking about these data. We're talking about the size of the group, and because it's so small, there's a lot of noise around the estimate.
Right. Just like there is in the 7. Right.
Yes. So, and that's why they are italicized.
They're
You can see that they're the smallest groups.
Right.
The other two the other piece that I want to point out to you is this almost 10% of at-risk gamblers who transitioned into being problem and pathological gamblers versus the just over half of the at-risk gamblers who transitioned into a less severe category, into recreational gambling.
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
So if you look at the at-risk gamblers in wave one, you can see that there's movement both ways.
Yeah.
Some people went up and a lot more people went down.
Yes.
Okay?
201 became recreational.
Yes.
Yep.
And then the problem gambling group, which is actually a little bit more stable than the at-risk group, quite a number of people transition to either at risk, close to equal numbers transition down or way down. So this is sort of just
Rachel, do you have any? I mean, I found this data to be the most striking of all the results of this study, because here we're in an environment which is basically pre-introduction of casino gambling in the Commonwealth, and yet you have all of this fluidity between these different categories.
right.
Do you have any
Well-
thoughts yet preliminarily as to what could explain this?
I will say that that these transitions are the fact of the transitions is not a surprise. We've seen that in all of the other studies, the cohort studies that I've been involved with or that Rob has been involved with, and it actually is extremely interesting, because what we're learning from the cohort studies and from Massachusetts now as well about the fluidity of a person's problem gambling status at any given point in time somewhat contradicts the view of pathological or disordered gambling that is enshrined in the DSM, which is that disordered or pathological gambling is a progressive and chronic and unremitting disorder. And clearly it's not.
Right.
So Massachusetts is similar to other studies in other jurisdictions that have found these kinds of transitions. Where it's unusual and where we are not on solid ground is understanding that the rate of transitions in Massachusetts is actually much higher than the rate of transitions that we've seen in other jurisdictions. So I have a calculation in the report that shows that about 14% of people in the cohort moved into a less severe group, and almost 15% moved into a more severe group. And the rates that we have from some of these other studies are in the 4 to 5% range. So there's clearly something going on in Massachusetts, or to my mind, there's something going on in Massachusetts that's unusual. But what we don't know is if it just happens to be this particular period of time when we took these measures, or if it's something about the population of Massachusetts that's a little bit unique, or if there's hopefully something that we've measured that we just haven't analyzed yet that will help us figure out what's going on.
Well, there could also be the nature of the gaming market in the region, because the studies specifically for Massachusetts, but there's very nearby availability of casinos, and has been for some time. In fact, when the Gaming Act was being proposed, one of the states next to us responded by expanding their own gaming into table games. So it's just another.
Yeah, I mean that's the one of the features of doing gambling research in the United States is, you know, it's different from New Zealand or even from some of the European countries that I've been involved with, in that states are very quick to sort of make competitive moves when they see something happening across their border. Much faster. It's much more. It happens much more quickly in the U.S., I think, than in a lot of other jurisdictions where I've done this kind of work. And so I think that is an important thing to keep in mind, is that we may see bigger and faster changes in our cohort in both directions based on what's happening with, the competitive pressures in the region.
The value really comes over time in subsequent waves, that while we may see remission, is it remission for a short period of time while the person recovers financially before their gambling begins to ramp up again? Or is it truly remission and somebody maintains their status as a recreational or non-gambler after being an at-risk and problem gambler? I think that, and then throw the extra layer of opening casinos into the mix of that.
Yeah.
The value will come over time in measuring wave 4, 5, 6, and beyond.
And throughout all these measures, we will be able to ascertain protective factors and risk factors, correct?
Yeah, we're hoping by, wave 4 and 5, we're definitely going to be able to start to fill that picture in. But there just is a lot to kind of try and get our heads around, and we have a pretty interested review group, so the debate is long. But I think that, at the end of the day, the product the results will certainly stand the test of time. And, we only know what we know, and we'll try and figure out what we don't know going forward. I just want to sort of quickly get to the end of this because I know your time is valuable. But just to review, we found small but statistically significant increases in gambling participation. Problem gambling incidence prior to casinos in Massachusetts appears high, but as we point out in the report, it is subject to some methodological limitations as well as to, possibly some other things that are going on in the environment. We did determine that we had some differential response rates, which may have resulted in heavier gamblers, not problem gamblers, but heavier gamblers being more willing to participate in the cohort study, which we tried to adjust for, but we may not have been fully successful. As the reviewers pointed out, we have a longer inter-assessment interval than some of the other cohort studies that have been done. And there is a question of the reliability of problem gambling as it's measured based on self-report.
Aren't the other ones done by self-reporting also?
Yes, they're all done by self-report.
So that doesn't, why would that possibly be a factor? I mean, the whole business might be unrealistic, inaccurate because of self-reporting, but that's
Right.
not something unique about this methodology.
No, but it was something that the reviewers pointed out on pretty much every occasion. So I
But
felt it was
I just agree that it's an issue, but you're making
Right.
a distinction between these rates and the rates with other studies. That I don't think is one of the variables here, but whatever.
yeah. I'll rethink that bullet.
All right.
Okay. And then the last piece in terms of stability and change, the transition rates do appear to be higher, but again, it could be due to the longer window between the assessments, and also possibly due to the fact that we use the PPGM rather than the CPGI, which was used in most of the other studies. So I think this is my last slide, next to last slide.
Wait a second, I'm sorry.
Yep.
Incidence appears higher than in other studies by quite a bit, but stability and change seem similar. How can that be?
Stability and change seem similar in the sense that it was happening. I did point out a little while ago that the rate of transitions does seem to be higher in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And the incidence rate we also think is higher. But as we have discussed it with the review committee, there are some possible explanations. If I can just get onto this next slide.
Okay, fine.
Oops, going the wrong way. So in terms of if these findings are accurate, and the question is whether they are, they're accurate here, but are they meaningful in the long term? If the incidence rate is accurate, and it is a good bit higher than incidence rates that we identified in these other studies, it's unclear why that would be the case, because again, as Lloyd has pointed out, there have not been many changes in the availability of legal gambling in Massachusetts between the two waves of this study. So it's unclear why it would be higher. But if it is higher, then it suggests that prevention resources may well be needed ahead of the casino's opening to reduce that incidence rate going forward.
Let me make sure I understand this one. So what you're saying is, if assuming this data is representative of what's going on, we do have a significantly higher incidence rate than other places. Doesn't have anything to do with casinos, but just as a matter of public policy, it might be something people want to know about.
Right.
And, okay.
And a matter of public health as well.
Yeah, I got it.
You
But
know,
the point is, and I'm thinking about the next meeting that we have coming up with the same conversation is going to take
Right.
place. You know, the Public Health Trust Fund in Massachusetts is designed to deal with the impact of casino gambling.
right, right.
Having this in here suggests that the Public Health Trust Fund better sit around, oh my God, we better get moving here before the casino's open, because the data is telling we should deal with this problem. That's something that might go to the Department of Public Health, but
Right.
not to the Public Health Trust Fund, because we had enough trouble trying to get ready to figure out how to mitigate the implications
Of the
and causes of casinos.
Right.
But to try to worry about whatever else is going on right now is not our problem. It's not our mandate. It's an issue, and it's worth pointing out to somebody. But to put that line in here is I think sets off alarm bells, like, oh my God, we better get moving. And that's not what we want to have happen. And in fact, that's not even the mandate of the Public Health Trust Fund.
Okay,
So if you could scratch that point, you know,
okay,
I think that would make sense. I mean, if you can say, as an aside, you might say to the folks from DPH, it appears that there are problems in the gambling culture here in Massachusetts. If we're right about this, and we might not be, but if we are, there are other issues going on here. Mike Sweeney, we might want to talk about the, you know,
what the lottery
but
could do.
for
Yeah.
purposes of the Public Health Trust Fund, it's not a factor.
Right, okay.
Okay.
Okay, has the Public Health Trust Fund already gotten these slides?
Well,
Okay.
yeah, whatever. You can say,
Well,
ignore that one because it's really not relevant to the PHTV.
I know you don't like to, in this context, speculate, but if I may, could there be that there's some anticipation factor at work here?
Yeah.
And
Yes,
as well as how the tight market in New England really operates,
And-
because
and
there has
also
been some
some-
expansion around us.
And also some anticipatory competitive spending by operators in other states. I
Right.
mean, there's a lot of things that could be driving this higher incidence rate. And, you know, we can speculate, but until we've done our due diligence with triangulating these results with other data that we have from SIGMA in particular, but also from some secondary data sources, you know, it's early days to be jumping the gun.
Right.
And so similarly, if the remission rate is also high, as it looks to be with 50%, it suggests that that treatment and recovery support resources would also be well advised. So just to wrap this up,
Because remission is a good thing, we ought to seize on it, make the most of it.
try and
People
make
are
it happen
susceptible
more.
to
Yes.
remission, so let's act on it.
Yeah,
Okay.
make it happen more and keep it in place. You know, help people to maintain it.
Right.
So what are the
And that-
pathways to remission, and how do we maximize those pathways?
And that goes back to the point that you made earlier, as I understand it, that the fluidity, even amongst problem gamblers, sort of puts, at least challenges, you know, the proposition that once a problem gambler, always a problem gambler. There really is flexibility in the.
I mean, you know, there is that proportion of people who are clearly just problem gamblers every time you take a look at them, but the more common picture is sort of movement in and out.
Right.
And the question from a public health perspective or from a treatment perspective is, how do you get people to move down the spectrum, and how do you keep them down there, you know, and prevent them from moving to the more extreme, more severe end of the spectrum? So, in terms of due diligence, we definitely are planning to look at a number of other data sources that we have to try to understand what we identified in this first wave or this first establishment of the cohort. We have the targeted baseline and follow-up surveys in Plainville that we already are beginning to look at, not just for this purpose, but also for development of the impact study, of the impact report that we have coming up later this year. We actually have, in the BGPS, the baseline population survey, we actually had a large enough sample of people from Springfield and surrounding communities that we were able to pull them out of the BGPS. And then we have a year later, no, 2 years later, I think, from 2015, a year later, once the Gaming Commission had identified Springfield as the MGM as the licensee, we went in and did a targeted baseline survey in Springfield. So we actually have 2 baseline samples from Springfield that we want to take a look at and see if we see any changes in gambling behavior or problem gambling in Springfield and surrounding communities in the same period of time that we were doing the magic work. We want to take a look at incidents in wave 3 of magic. We're beginning to, reminding me to do something else. We actually want to take a look at wave 3, and we're starting to do that analytic work right now. And then we're hoping that we can also triangulate further using some secondary data from DPH on treatment seeking, as well as helpline calls from the Massachusetts Council. And we know that there's a count that's kept on a monthly basis of GA meetings. So we think those might be some additional pieces of information that we could feed into a sort of a larger picture of what might have been going on during this period. And then following up on this report, we actually have some deeper analyses of this data that we're planning. We want to look at differences in incidence and transitions by gender, because men and women are known to have different trajectories. We want to look at the role of involvement with specific types of gambling and see if we can figure out if there's differences in incidence and transition related to types of gambling, although we're a little bit limited with sample size there. And then we want to begin to focus some work on factors that predict change in people's status, with a particular focus on people who develop a gambling problem and those who are who move into remission. So that's work for the future.
Great. We didn't
And I
want you
think
to
you've
get,
already asked your question.
we didn't want you to get bored.
Oh, I don't think it's possible. Not in this lifetime.
Anybody else? Anything?
Great work.
Yeah,
I think
great.
it's fascinating and incredible.
Thank you.
And remember, this is just the start.
Just the
you know,
beginning,
Just the
absolutely.
beginning, right. Let's take a very quick break, and then we'll come back and go back into the next item. We are reconvening public meeting 232, and we are going to skip to item number 5 from the legal division, General Counsel Blue and or her deputy, Mr. Grossman.
Mr. Gross.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
We have before you a draft, a non-disclosure agreement. This is based upon the conversation you had at your last meeting, where we reviewed the request by MGM Springfield to protect certain information and categories of information. This is how we have commemorated the discussion. This is, at least in form, the exact same language we used in the case of Plain Ridge Park Casino's non-disclosure agreement. I think it's satisfactory to both protect the information and clarify what the process will be. With your approval, we would ask that Mr. Bedrosian and a representative from MGM Springfield sign it so that it's formally executed.
Questions, comments?
We already had the general discussion, right, last time. Remind me.
That's correct, yes.
And there were a couple of petitions that we disagreed with, or one in particular. Remind me. Do you remember?
There were a couple. I think they were all resolved.
Yeah.
There were a couple that we discussed back and forth. I know there were. I'm trying to remember the incident reports, for example, where individuals' names were mentioned. We suggested, and this reflects that it's discretionary on the part of the commission as to whether we turn someone's name over or we
Right.
hold it under the privacy exemption.
Yes.
So that was an issue in a couple of different
Yeah.
areas. I think that was the big one.
That was a big one. Yeah.
The other complicated one are number 6 and 7 here, which deal.
Which was the number of the one you just?
Let
mentioned?
me see. I think
Well,
14.
well, because
At 14 and 28, I think.
but they were asking for something broader than what's reflected here, so it might not necessarily be
Yeah, okay. What we decided not to do is not reflected here.
precisely.
Yeah,
okay.
we talked a lot about the interaction between what they requested in the public records and how we would address it. So any public record issue would not be reflected in this, but that was the tenor of our discussion.
Yeah. No, but thank you for that clarification. I'm sorry to.
Todd, is there some of the informational material that we capture? It'd be interesting at some point to see if there's, and I talked about this with Catherine, some type of template we can create so that all of our licensees are somewhat submitting the same information in the same form. You know, we're collecting certain, looking at number 1, an annual business plan. That can be anything. You know, can we work on creating templates that, you know, kind of provide some efficiencies for our licensees, at least in capturing the information by creating a template that they can all use.
Absolutely, and I think we have started to discuss reporting formats and things of that nature. So that is a great idea and one that we'll certainly work to implement.
But kudos for getting this done in advance. I know we did PPC after they opened, so this is good work. Good work on behalf of MGM as well to get this wrapped up before they open.
Anybody else?
Are there outstanding, objections from MGM?
I think I'm confident in reporting that they're generally comfortable with this. We would, with your approval, just leave it open for possible typographical and non-substantive minor modifications prior to execution. But otherwise, I think in form and substance, this is an agreed upon generally.
And we can always come back and amend. I think we've done that for PPC, right? They've
have.
requested an additional.
As
Amendment.
we move forward and there are other concerns that arise, we will bring them back to you if we need to amend it. We have, I think, 2 or 3 times with PPC, so I expect that will occur here as well.
Is it fair to say, Mr. Nozel, that I can state on the record that you have been nodding your head in answer?
Yes, and I had said to I had said to Deputy General Counsel Grossman earlier that one thing that didn't come across in our discussion the last time before you, that this really represented months of work, and I think we were in agreement on 95% of it. We discussed some policy issues that we thought were important to bring up to the commission, but I believe that this document sort of represents something that the company is willing to go forward with. And as I think General Counsel Blue has indicated, this also certainly can be changed if we run into any unanticipated issues, and I imagine we'll come to you from time to time to add to it.
Catherine, number 15. is that the same language that's in the PPC non-disclosure?
I believe so, yes, and that's why it's covered by the non-disclosure.
Okay. Well, because in this case, I wish John were here, but there's been, remember this, the topic came up at the GPAC about whether or not we could ask them for salaries and benefits, and we said no, thinking at that point that they had said that it was covered under a non-disclosure, and that we couldn't break that. But now I think that the issue was specific jobs and specific positions, not categories of what you call it,
Ranges.
on job categories. So if, and I'm just not sure we're all exactly on the same page, because John said he was talking to PPC and saying, no, we'd really like to have you be willing to give us ranges of salaries for categories of jobs. Is that okay with you? As if it was up to them. But if this is already in the agreement, then it's not up to them. They've already agreed.
But they've already agreed that it's covered by the NDA, so we would receive it, we can't release it. That was the response to the GPAC, was that the information is covered under a non-disclosure agreement, thus we cannot release it.
No, but what's
who-
covered under the non-disclosure is specific jobs.
Yes.
The ranges of a job category. For example, housekeepers will be from 30,000 to 37,000 or whatever it is. Those we can release. That's not covered under. the
Well, it's not covered,
Depends
but
who we're talking about here.
to answer your question though, as I think John sort of relayed, we are in the midterm review of PPC's license conditions. I asked PPC to come back to us with some idea of what they would be comfortable releasing. That notwithstanding that we have this language, we did receive a request. I want to understand what they thought they could release, and maybe they will come back with something about
Okay.
ranges. I don't know.
So this,
We are in discussions.
so what you're saying I hear is, yes, so far that information is broad job categories with salary ranges is not covered under the NDA, but that's not the same thing as saying they'd be comfortable with us releasing it.
Well, and it also, keep in mind, we don't receive that information. So what's under the NDA is what we receive. We receive specific information. We don't receive it, I don't believe, in job categories. But I have put a question to PPC as to what they would be willing to turn over, because we know we have a request, and I want to have that conversation with them. So they are reviewing our request for what they would feel comfortable, notwithstanding that there's an NDA on this information.
Right, okay.
Because it's fair to say that when we did the NDA with PPC, these may not have read exactly like it reads now in MGM's NDA, correct?
We would have to look,
I think that's right. I think
Yeah,
we
we'd
added
have to
that
look at it.
parenthetical.
We
here.
did add the
Oh, wait a minute.
parenthetical.
But that's
yes.
what I just asked. I said, is this the same as PPC?
No,
You
no,
said
no.
yes.
That was my point. It may not be because of the parenthetical that we
Well,
talked
that's
about
the whole
last
point.
time.
That was my whole point. No, so it's not the same as PPC.
yeah, it doesn't mean that we get the information.
I
in the
understand
form
that. I ask, is it the
we
same
want.
thing or not? And it's not.
Well, we have to check.
We have to check it, yeah.
But
Yeah, okay.
the conversation I remember from last time on MGM was what gave way to this parenthetical.
Right.
That MGM only is, at least I remember that, are comfortable releasing salary ranges.
Right.
They're just uncomfortable with the specifics.
Right. I'm fine
And we're all
with it,
fine
too.
with that.
So now we just have to reconcile what we're thinking we would like to be able to do and
With
what
PPC.
PPC so far says they're willing to do. Okay. Any other discussion about this item? Mr. Nozel, are you bringing? Okay.
Appreciate everybody's attention.
Mr. Chair, I move that the commission approve the non-disclosure agreement as included in the packet between the commission and MGM Sprinkler
Second?
or Blue Tarp.
Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously.
And just for clarification purposes, I assume that gives me the authorization to sign on behalf of the commission.
To sign what?
Yes.
On behalf of
Sign.
the commission, signed it,
Yeah.
signed.
Go for it.
So moved.
And we, thanks to council, we were able to clarify the PPC NDA does not include that parenthetical.
Okay.
We added that for this.
Okay.
All right.
On the to-do list.
Right. All right, now we are back to item number 4, finally.
Good news is we're still with Deputy General Counsel
Sorry, we're
Grossman.
back to 3A. Oh, we still with, we have more?
No, different topic.
But it's still.
Still me.
Oh, still you, all right. Item 3A brings back Deputy General Counsel Grossman.
Okay. Interestingly, we're coming upon the 5-year anniversary of the Commission's approval of the inaugural Enhanced Code of Ethics.
Huh.
This certainly seems like a good time to have a fresh look at it. It's always healthy to review some of the early policy determinations that were made. And of course, before you, you have prepared a version of the code that incorporates a number of proposed and hypothetical amendments to the enhanced code. And I'm happy to work through them one by one, or if we want to start by just addressing certain areas first, we can do that as well, whatever your preference would be.
I mean, we could just go with, on an exception, have us raise where we have questions, say the general briefing. We're pretty familiar with this. Is that all right?
I could do
Commissioner
that.
Stebbins, do you want to start? And do you have anything you want to raise?
Nope.
Commissioner Zuniga?
Sure. Let me. There's 2 sections that maybe work together, and I just want to clarify the applicability. Now, as we discussed,
What page are you on?
page 1 crosses out in general consultants, and that's true for the whole code.
Right.
But we left, and I just want to, confirm that this is intentional. On 14, on section 14,
Section 14.
on the prohibition, on the restriction about wagering, we leave consultants
No,
on the section.
that should come out too. That was
Okay.
just, there might be 1 or 2 other areas that
Okay.
I missed that.
Good.
That should,
Parallel structure.
all the consultants should come out. Although
Yep.
on that point, there is one area where I think we need to leave a reference to consultants, and that's the actual definition of the term consultant. It's important still, though the code would not de facto apply to consultants. It's important that we draw a distinction between consultants and employees for purposes of understanding who the code does apply to. So I'm not proposing that we delete the definition of the term consultant, because it's still important to include here. But as you're referencing, essentially, if we were to delete the term consultant from those specific provisions, what would be left with that on a case-by-case basis when we negotiate contracts with consultants, we could make the code applicable to them or not, depending upon the nature of the work that they're doing, and specifically make it applicable to certain employees within their organization, should they be larger than 1 or 2 people. And it's just a more precise way, I think, of addressing this issue.
Yes, and that's the conversation I remember Council Blue pointing out, that we have a lot more, it's a much better timing given the specifics. Many of these are case specifics, to do it via the contract we have with them. They're pretty good with them.
Yeah, I also think it shows, as we've talked about in the past, sort of the maturation of the commission and staff. When you all drafted this, consultants were doing a big chunk of your substantive work here, including investigation. So at the time, it seemed to make sense to capture them as employees, because quite frankly, they were in many aspects acting as employees. Now we're a much more mature organization where we are hiring consultants in a true sort of consultant capacity, hopefully one-offs. And as Deputy General Counsel Grossman said, in that case, we will still retain the authority, if we think it's important, to contract that the consultants be covered by the Enhanced Code of Ethics. So we're not just wholeheartedly giving that up.
Great, yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't quite remembered that, so that's good.
And just to clarify it even further, just so there's no confusion, certain consultants, depending upon the nature of what work they do and how much of it they do, are still subject to the state conflict of interest law, special state employees. And so we are in no way relieving them of that. obligation and the obligations under the conflict of interest laws. We're merely talking about the applicability of our enhanced code of ethics to these folks.
Good. Let me just restate that because I know there's somebody, a reporter who just walked in, who's interested about the issue of consultants, and I'll restate it, make sure I'm saying it right, Andy. What we've decided to do, or what's proposed here, and that we're discussing and leaning towards doing, is eliminating consultants from the blanket involvement in, or blanket coverage from these multiple sections of the enhanced ethics code, feeling like that was too broad a brush. But we retain the case-by-case right as we contract with consultants to apply the enhanced ethics code either to their company or to individuals within their company as we see fit on a case-by-case basis. So what we're doing is eliminating the blanket coverage, but keeping open the option of applying where we think it makes sense. Right?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah, and just to make the point that that Todd just made, you know, again, that even though that the consultants from here on would not be obliged to comply with the enhanced code of ethics, they remain obliged to comply with the regular state standards of ethical behavior. Right.
If they meet the requirements, but essentially, yes.
I had
Okay,
another
go ahead. Yeah.
question. I mean, or we could
go ahead.
jump on. Okay, I'm on question. I'm on page 5. Just one for clarification, and this is probably just formatting. In the conflict of interest section, sub C talks about commissioners must recusing themselves from licensing decisions given potential conflicts. There is additional language that goes on to say that one's impartiality, probably referring to commissioners, may not be reasonably questioned if, you know, such things happen, including the determination from the executive director finds that no conflict exists. Is that to say that such recusal may no longer be necessary? Or is the intent to continue to be recused? It's just a statement that your impartiality is no longer questionable.
Well, there's two parts to paragraph C. The first is the first sentence, which says that commissioners, and this only applies to commissioners, must recuse themselves from a licensing decision in which a potential conflict of interest exists. That's in the statute, and that's what it says. It applies only to commissioners. So you cannot disclose that and continue to participate. That's what the statute says. The second part is slightly different. It applies to commissioners and all employees. And it says that, to answer your question, you would be able to participate. If your impartiality can be reasonably questioned, you have to disqualify and recuse yourself. But what we're saying here is that similar to the way these types of conflicts are handled under the state conflict of interest law, if one discloses a potential conflict like this, then your superior finds that you can be fair and objective in whatever the decision is or whatever the incident is you're working on, then your impartiality can no longer be reasonably questioned. So we're really just removing the question. It's important to remember that this is different from a financial conflict of interest where there's an actual conflict there. Here we're just talking about someone questioning a perception as to whether you can really be fair and objective. Okay. When there's money involved, it's different. The de novo assumption is you cannot be fair and objective. But here we're saying, well, someone's really not sure. If you disclose it and your superior says, yes, I believe you can be fair and objective, then we're saying that no one can no longer reasonably question your objectivity there. And that's
it's not just your superior, it's the executive director. So the executive director would have to approve each one of these judgments that disclosure relieved you of any possibility of a reasonable expectations of impartiality.
That's right.
So
to that end, I would suggest, I was just reading through this again, the language you read there, Commissioner, at the end, that the executive director finds that no conflict exists. I think it should actually be the executive director finds that the person can be fair and objective. That's really the finding, not
You're right.
not that no
Right.
conflict.
That's a great point.
And Todd, just so for my clarification, is the executive director, whether it's me or some subsequent executive director, finding that you can be fair and impartial for employees, or employees are commissioners, or do commissioners go to the appointing authority?
Well, it's a good question. I think we can do it either way. Here it's set up so that the executive director would sign off on all of the commissioners as well.
Okay.
We
Well-
could have it that the chair signs off on other commissioners and that the director signs off on the chair. I mean, there's a number of ways of doing it.
Well, and I think keep in mind too, this is the enhanced ethics code.
Right,
So
so
we
this is not-
enforce the enhanced ethics code. There is
Right.
a separate hierarchy for 268A where you go to your appointing authority. So for this particular issue, it would go to the executive director or the chair.
I'm comfortable, if you're comfortable, on the enhanced ethics, having that authority. Obviously, I would need to report to someone. I assume it's the chair.
To the chair, I think,
Right.
yeah, the executive director would appoint, it would go to the chair. Oh, that's actually not in here, so we need.
Maybe should the first sentence be
Stand alone.
a separate point? And because it is kind of hard to figure out which antecedents relate to what. And that this ought to be, maybe section D would be this from commissioner and employees on down.
Definitely, yes.
So we might want to
sounds
take a
good.
shot at clarifying, even maybe do a
Yeah.
bullet point.
Right. Right.
Chain of
Right.
authority.
Okay, others?
That's all I have.
I had a couple. I had said that I was interested in what other jurisdictions do on whether commissioners and employees can go have dinner at a licensed. But did we get any of that information?
We did.
And what's the?
So just to calibrate the discussion, we're on this is paragraph 15 on page 7, is
15A,
what the chair
right.
is asking about, essentially whether commissioners' employees may attend casinos and eat and drink and things, go to shows, things of that nature.
Not gamble, but
Not
social. Could other places can you socialize basically?
Exactly. So the answer to your question is we checked with Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Nevada, and in each location, employees are allowed to attend the casinos, provided that they pay advertised, posted prices, essentially that they don't receive any unwarranted privileges. In one or two instances, they note that you have to watch out for appearances of conflicts. But as a general matter, those are certainly more mature jurisdictions. They do allow their employees to go to their casinos.
Does that include commissioners?
I believe so.
So let me just put this out, and this may be one we want to save for Gail. I'm not sure where she would come down on this. But what I had originally said at the last meeting was, personally, and I'm sort of 56-44 on this. Personally, it's always struck me as funny, as not particularly constructive, that an employee, particularly, but also a commissioner, couldn't go to one of these facilities and sort of see how it's operating. I mean, one of the things I would kind of like to do would be to go to one of these, be a customer and see what it's like. But we have always eliminated that, and so that was fine. I certainly understand a couple of things. Well, number one, you should not get anything of value. You should pay listed prices. I would add, submit receipts of such events to the executive director, just so that there's a record of it. And I think the thing about, being cautious on appearances too. But on a 56-44 basis, in my judgment, I think that makes more sense. And I wanted to know what the other jurisdictions do, because I think that's a reasonable guide, and I had no idea what they would say, but it turns out all three of them pretty much agree with my sense of that. So I'm curious to know what you all think. If you disagree, then I'll drop it. If you think it's worth pursuing, then we'll pursue it.
I personally just think we can avoid a lot of headaches and spread our wealth around if we dine or eat off premises.
Yeah, I'm a 56-44 in the other direction.
All right, so that's three, so forget it.
The
Okay.
appearance
That's fine. All right.
is such a
That's over.
question. That,
My last one was, so we're eliminating the issue about commissioners can't solicit funds for nonprofits,
yes.
15B.
Well, I struck that just so you would see what it looks like. I think it's an issue that the commission needs to address. The fact that it's been struck through is no indication that it's been decided.
Oh, but are you recommending it? I thought these other ones were things that you were recommending based on.
Oh, no, that one I'm not necessarily recommend. Most of the stuff I think it's fair to say that we're recommending. This one, it seems like it certainly was at the time anyway, a sound policy to ensure that applicants for big gaming licenses don't intentionally try to support organizations that commissioners are involved with financially in order to curry favor. Perhaps that concern is lessened at the moment. I think it's. I guess I'm fairly neutral on this particular issue at the moment. There are still conflict of interest laws that apply to outside activity.
I like striking these through. I think I forget if this was a discussion I just had with you on the briefing or in a public meeting before, but
I'm glad you forget too.
I think initially that scenario was important to consider, in which we were prior to licensing, but I think there's a lot of personal involvement that is fruitful for the individual with charitable organizations, for us to think differently now.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, just a question on a segment of this. Is the portion, Todd, that talks about be a speaker or guest of honor at an organization's fundraising events, is that covered anywhere else in kind of the state's overall conflict of interest?
Well, it is in
guideline?
that you cannot, under the unwarranted privileges provisions of the law, you can't use your title, your state title, to raise money in a personal capacity. So you couldn't say, Bruce Stebbins, commissioner, will be speaking at this event. Please donate $50.
That's a bad example because nobody would.
Please
show.
donate $5 to come see him speak.
We'll pay you $5.
We'll give you
We'll
$5.
pay you $5 to show.
So you'd need to be very careful about things like that under the state conflict of interest law anyway. Now, if just Bruce Stebbins, citizen, is coming to speak because he's going to say something interesting, the state conflict of interest law is probably not implicated in any way. The reason we put this in here, though, is that everyone, of course, knows you're a gaming commissioner, and even now we would want to be careful that the gaming licensees don't, support your causes just because, they want to make sure that they stay on your good side. So that's where the enhanced part of the Code of Ethics comes in. We recognize there is a law covering that already, but we wanted to be super careful on that particular point.
On the agenda, this appears to be up for a vote today. Is that right?
It is. I might suggest just one, given some of the issues you pointed out specifically on that one paragraph, and of course I've lost it now, 9C, I think.
Yep.
Maybe we take one more quick shot at refining some of the stuff having Commissioner Cameron come back and do a vote on a final product.
Well,
Well,
Go ahead.
can I just say on 15B, I would be in favor of maintaining the current language.
why?
Because we're still at an early point in the enterprise of introducing gaming in the Commonwealth. There is such a high level of concern about integrity and the maintenance of integrity Commonwealth wide, and that this is, in my view, an appropriate kind of super standard that would distinguish us and our obligations as commissioners.
And I stated my thought about this earlier. I think this is, to me, this is too broad. What probably made sense when the stakes were so huge, and there was a lot writing, and there was an opportunity for people to try to reach us. But to have a blanket, there is a blanket. We can petition the commission for a waiver from it, and I've thought about doing it with this one case in point that's come up. I've mentioned to you a board I serve that I know somebody on a board of directors of a biotech company has got zero to do with gaming, and right now I can't help this organization reach out to this organization, to this potential donor. If there were, in order to protect, I certainly would say you can't solicit from licensees or applicants. You could even, if you really were concerned about it, you could even think about putting something in that said you can't serve on a board that gets money from a gaming commission, like gaming licensee, because the overlap is going to be so little that's hardly a problem. But it would get to the concern that that Lloyd is raising. But to have a blanket prohibition where nonprofits that we all serve on, where we can't help raise money in a way which is emphatically and clearly not a conflict, does not seem appropriate to me anymore. So if you want to try to beef up 9C or redraft B that goes that eliminates the blanket but tries to take away the sniff test issues as well as the actual possible issues that concern us all, particularly Lloyd, I'd go for that, and then we deal with it in the finality next session.
So I think we will, let me ask you this, are there any other, do we want to close this out? Are there any other open discussion items? Because if there aren't, we will assume that we need to clarify 9C in a way that's sort of understandable to the decision, and that we will give you some options on 9B, which may be keeping it.
15B.
I'm sorry, thank you. 15B, which may range from keeping it to getting rid of it, and maybe something in between, and have Commissioner Cameron back for that final discussion.
Sounds good to me.
And I might say on the record that I'm 55-45 on this.
Okay.
I think there also, and I've talked about it before, I think on 15B, there's some clarification needed. And I don't know how we, wrestle with this, but, be a speaker or guest of honor at organizations' fundraising events. When we go out and are invited to speak at, say, a Chamber of Commerce event, it doesn't necessarily fall into what you would see as a nonprofit fundraising event. But for that Chamber of Commerce,
It's a fundraiser.
they're not just charging for the meal. So just kind of clarifying that a little bit more and maybe segmenting that out as well.
I think that's a fair point too. I could see unless we put in the thing that I said about you can't serve on the board of an organization that receives contributions from a licensed organization. That would take care of your problem. But unless we do that, then having us be a headliner at a fundraiser which anybody, including licensees, can contribute to, that's a bridge too far. So I'm with you on that. One of those two ways, I would suggest getting at it.
Yeah, that speaks to the broadness of how it was originally written.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Okay, that's it. General Counsel, Deputy General Counsel Grossman, you got anything else under your hat?
If you're all comfortable with the other proposed changes, as mentioned, we can put together a proposed final version and give it one more go.
Great. So where are we? What's left
I think we're
only
on
is,
6.
yeah, commissioner updates. Do we have any?
I have two quick ones. As Executive Director Bedrosian mentioned earlier in his report, we had another great meeting of the Access and Opportunity Committee meeting out in Springfield. Our licensees continue to focus on meeting their diversity goals. But the tenor of the meeting yesterday in Springfield was interesting because we finally now see a window of where the work with MGM is going to end. And
Construction work you talking about?
the construction work, or this
Yeah,
part of the
right,
AOC's work
I see,
monitoring
okay.
MGM during the construction phase. But there was several sentiments, and I hope I'm capturing this correctly, of a little bit of remorsefulness amongst the crowd in terms of continuing the diversity work as it extends to other kind of construction projects out in that region. There isn't that pipeline of construction and crane work going on in Western Mass as much as there is in Eastern Mass. But there was still some interesting level of willingness, on behalf of Susan Moyer and Liz Skidmore and the building trades that are represented at these meetings. That there was this, we want somebody to kind of pick up the mantle of diversity in the construction workforce and kind of keep carrying it through a number of different strategies. But I think there was, there's been this great partnership that has evolved in the AOC meetings, and kind of thinking ahead that the work with MGM in a short amount of time is going to come to an end, and how through all the great work that a lot of the stakeholders have done is their way to kind of carry it on. But credit to our licensees, they still do corrective action meetings with the building trades and subs and contractors to make sure that as we slide towards these final months of construction on both projects, that nobody's letting up in terms of making sure that diversity goals are met. So that was encouraging. I also had the opportunity to stop by a great announcement involving MGM.
Excuse just one sec. I think it's a really interesting feeling to express and capture, and I'm thinking we might just think about whether it would be a way as we roll to the end of the AOC meetings, not only in MGM but also coming up in Wynn, for us to do some kind of a recommendation report, case study where we talk about how this came about, what it's accomplished, the metrics to demonstrate its success, and urge certainly other state agencies, but other building sites, private and public, to learn from this experience and maybe to adopt this model. It might be something that we could certainly blog it. Maybe Commissioner Stebbins writes a blog and we send that out. We might maybe be able to publish something in Banker and Tradesman or whatever the right publication would be.
I think that's a great idea.
It would be great. I mean, we work with Elaine to try to figure out the right medium, but it's a case study we should be proud of. The suggestion came along, we leapt on it, and we played it out in spades, so to speak. And I think we should try to push that lesson out there.
I think it's a great idea. Part of the conversation, and again going back to Susan and some of the building trade stakeholders, they're looking for other opportunities. Whether it's through local responsible employer ordinances for construction projects in various municipalities, but they're certainly trying to find a way to say this was a great best practice. There are other best practices attached to it. How can we, I think to your point, Mr. Chair, kind of keep the legacy of our success kind of moving forward,
right?
Through other
That's
capital
great.
projects.
Well, you could even tell them, share with them your idea of trying to formalize this in some way and pick their brains and have them contribute to what you might put together.
I think that's a great idea.
Okay, great.
The second the event I went to with MGM Springfield, they have engaged a number of other hospitality stakeholders out in Western Mass and have partnered up with Cambridge College, which has a site in Springfield, as well as the Department of Labor and Workforce Development's apprenticeship program, to approve a kind of hospitality apprenticeship program that has gotten Labor and Workforce Development sign-off. So they had the kickoff yesterday that MGM was at. A number of stakeholders, they're actually going to have a class on kind of Springfield concierge, so that everybody who's trained in hospitality has some awareness of the other cultural and tourism aspects around the valley. So when you ask a bartender, gee, you know, where's this? They'll be kind of staffed with the information to be able to make that. But as the story goes, and I'm interestingly enough connected to Cambridge College because I was working for the city when we helped them relocate downtown. But Wanda Gisbert from MGM, and MGM's offices are right across the street, looked out the window one day and saw Cambridge College and said, who the heck are they and what do they do? And that quickly evolved into a great partnership. So it was a good event.
That's great. Terrific. Anybody else? All right. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All in favor? Aye. Thank you. We are adjourned.